This rational idea of a peaceful, even if not friendly, thoroughgoing community of all nations on the earth that can come into relations affecting one another is not a philanthropic, ethical principle, but a principle having to do with rights. Nature has enclosed them all together within determinate limits by the spherical shape of the place they live in, a globus terraquois, and since possession of the land on which an inhabitant of the earth can live can be sought only as possession of a part of a determinate whole, and so as possession of that to which each of them originally has a right, it follows that all nations stand originally in a community of land, though not of rightful community of possession, communio, and so of use of it, or of property in it. Instead, they stand in a community of possible physical interaction, commercium, that is, in a thoroughgoing relation of each to all the others, of offering to engage in commerce with any other. And each has a right to make this attempt without the other being authorized to behave toward it as an enemy because it has made this attempt. Immanuel Kant. Since the beginning of this year, throughout several lectures, I have talked about what Kant has to say about public right. And I want to close this off now with this lecture on what he calls the cosmopolitan right, or the world citizen's right in German. And I already gave a previous lecture about what is cosmopolitanism to Kant, what does the word mean when he uses it in his writing, in his thinking, where I talked about cosmopolitanism more as a posture, as an attitude that a person can take. And I explained that to Kant it basically means that you consider yourself not just as this or that particular individual with particular interests, belonging maybe to particular groups, to a class, a party, a nation, a certain profession or whatever, having the interests that you may have as a member of that group, but rather you are a cosmopolitan if you consider yourself as a citizen of the world at large, if you consider yourself as simply a human being as such, and therefore if you take an interest in the common benefit of humankind, if you take an interest in human progress, and that mainly means to Kant if you take an interest in universal justice and peace. And this cosmopolitan posture is one that, according to Kant, especially the scholars, the scientists, and the rulers, the heads of state, should have. And that should guide them in their scholarship or in their ruling and their relations with other nations. However, Kant is not so naive as to think that the ought also implies the is. He's not saying that these people necessarily are cosmopolitan, just that they ideally should be. But here in this lecture, I don't want to talk about cosmopolitanism as a posture. I want to talk about the cosmopolitan right. And that fits within the architectonic framework of Kant's philosophy of right, which I discussed again and again in several lectures, saying that to Kant, the right is about the mine and yours. It is about property and about protecting the mine and yours. And here he distinguishes between innate rights that we have by birth, so what we maybe would call human rights nowadays, because they are about what is mine by birth. So my body must not be harmed, I mustn't be killed, and so on. And on the other hand, there's acquired rights, because there's, of course, that which is not mine by birth, but which may become mine, like a piece of land, like a house, whatever. And Kant then distinguished the private right and the public right. The private right is valid even in the state of nature. The state of nature is a state where we have no public right, so we have no established laws, no publicly declared right, and we have no institutions that enforce the right, so we have no state, we have no courts, nothing. We just live in nature, we just live, so to say, in a wild jungle, we live in a state of anarchy. And here, reason still dictates what we shouldn't do. But of course, there's no guarantee that people will act on it, that people will follow the private right, whose principle is neminem ledere, harm nobody. And also, even if people were to try to follow it, still conflicts about the mine and yours could arise. For that reason, Kant says that we should enter a state of public right, we should form a social contract, we should establish laws, erect institutions that deal with those laws and enforce them. And the principle of this public right is suum quique tribui, give to each his own, which to Kant means that you should give everyone a guarantee that what is his will also remain his. You should make sure that you accept what is his, and of course he should accept what is yours. And this public right has only one job. The task of public right is to establish perpetual peace, because that is what peace to Kant means. Peace is not the same as ceasefire. Peace is not when people aren't fighting, because as long as fighting could theoretically break out at any moment, as long as you are constantly threatened, as long as you just depend on either the goodwill of others or the fact that others may not think it prudent to attack you because maybe they think they are too weak to do so, which is of course something that could always change, you are not living in peace. You are living in a state of war, even if it is a cold war, even if it is only a potential war. True peace to Kant is a state of justice. It is a state, once again, where each has his own and each has a guarantee of his own. So no one really has a reason to attack others and to try to take what is theirs. And even if they did, they would be stopped from doing so, or they would be punished afterwards, hopefully preventing them and others from doing it again. So true peace you only have in public right, because true peace you only have if there is actual justice. And this public right, once again, has three levels. There's the state's right, that is to establish peace between individuals within one state. If you don't have that, then you have anarchy, you have war between the individuals, like in a failed state, like in civil war, or like when there is no state at all in the first place. And then second, there's the right of nations, what we would call international law nowadays, which is through a League of Nations to establish right and thereby peace between states, between nations, not within them, but between them. Which of course is something that in our day, I mean, we made some progress since Kant's days, but as we can see in the current world situation, we are still very far from reaching that goal. But I already talked about those two, about stateswide and about the right of nations. Now what is left is the final level of the public right, is the cosmopolitan right. And this is a right that is supposed to encompass the whole globe, right? The stateswide is always just valid within one state. Within another state, there might be another stateswide. Now, the right of nations is also supposed to eventually cover the whole globe, as Kant would hope that eventually there would be peace between all nations, that eventually all nations would be included in the League of Nations that enforces peace, and that through a sort of world court makes sure that conflicts can be resolved in a civil manner. But it is clear that, at least for the time being, what Kant had in mind when he is talking about the right of nations and about the League of Nations that is to be established is mainly Europe, and is mainly a league, a federation that should include the European states and should establish peace within Europe, with the goal of eventually expanding that. But first, he's of course focused in the 18th century on the European nations. Now, what about cosmopolitan right? That is a right, once again, that is supposed to include the whole globe, to include all human beings. Even if there's a distance between them, even if they have no pre-established contact within one another. And indeed, that is precisely where cosmopolitan right matters, if there is no contact. Because once there is contact between human beings, then the two lower levels come into play, right? So if someone visits my state, some individual from a far off land, then now he falls under states' right, right? He can be included in the state either as a visitor, as a tourist, or whatever, or as a permanent member. Maybe he can get citizenship. And now what he is allowed to do and what I am allowed to do towards him is guided by the states' right of our particular state. And likewise, if nations come in contact with one another, like if two peoples live alongside each other, two states border each other, then of course this also does not fall under cosmopolitan right, but rather this falls under the right of nations. So cosmopolitan right is for those people, it's for the relationships between states and individuals, or between states and groups, or whatever, that have no contact with one another. Because as soon as contact is established, then the cosmopolitan right is replaced by states' right, or by the right of nations. Now, this may sound weird at first, because you might think, well, if there's no contact, then why would there even need to be a right? Because the right has to ensure that we don't harm each other in our property. No one takes what's mine. I don't take what is yours. And if we have no contact with one another, then nature ensures that, right? We cannot harm each other without contact. The right has to answer the question, how can several free beings live alongside each other? If they don't live alongside each other, no right is needed. So between the Europeans and the natives of America in the days before Columbus, there was, of course, no right, neither stateswide nor right of nations. But none was necessary because they could not do any harm to each other, right? They didn't even know of each other. Or let's say in antiquity between the Romans and the Chinese, maybe they had some very basic knowledge of each other's existence, but they had no proper connection that would have allowed them to harm each other. And likewise nowadays, we of course have no common right that binds us with some aliens on another planet, because we don't even know if they exist. And even if they do, right now we are not reaching each other, so it doesn't really matter. So you could say, as long as there's no contact, no right is needed. And as soon as there is contact, then you should enter the states right, or the right of nations. So how is there a place for a cosmopolitan right here? Well, Kant would say, it is for establishing contact, right? Because the state of nature, this lawless Wild West anarchy, and the civil state, where there is an established stateswide, with a state, with a constitution, or where there is an established right of nations, with a League of Nations, with a Court of Nations, or whatever. These two states are fundamentally different. And they are like night and day. They are like oil and water. So the question is, how would you transition from one into the other? To establish public right in the state of nature, you would have to make a contract. You would have to both agree to enter a state of common civil right. But then, how can you form a contract with someone if there is no pre-established right and you are in a state of war with one another? I mean, to put it simply, let's say you live at some seaside with your people, and now somebody comes to your shore from a far off land that you didn't even know existed, and you want to establish peaceful relations. You want to form a contract where he promises to respect your property that you already have here, and you promise to respect him, to not attack him, to not attack his ship, and so on. Let's say you now extend your hand to shake his hand, to sign this contract, basically. And now he uses this to, instead of taking your hand, cut off your hand. How can you be secured against this? Sure, if he had given his hand to you, from that moment on, you would have been under a common right that would have included don't cut off other people's hands. But since you're still in the state of nature, where you are essentially involved with each other, and can essentially not trust each other, there is no law yet prohibiting him from doing that. So Kant says the cosmopolitan right is only really about one thing, and that is, once again, the establishment of a relationship and of a legal relationship, of a relationship within the framework of public right. That is what cosmopolitan law has to ensure. People, even while in the state of nature, even before having made contact with one another, should act in such a manner that makes it possible to establish a peaceful, a just relationship, that makes it possible to leave this state of natural war of one against each other. And therefore, the cosmopolitan right only has one principle, according to Kant, which he calls the principle of hospitality. So, the cosmopolitan right demands from every human being, or from every rational being, it would also be valid for aliens if they landed here, to behave with hospitality, both as guests elsewhere and towards guests that might come to us. So, to put it simply, the cosmopolitan right really just tells us behave yourselves if you go to a foreign land, and also behave yourselves if someone from a foreign land comes to you. And that's all. And the basis for this cosmopolitan right and the need for it is the fact, Kant says, that we inhabit a globe which has limited space. Here I point you back to my lecture on the original acquisition and the theory of the ground. Because, as I said in that lecture, Kant's whole theory of right more or less is founded on that theory of the ground, and can best be understood if you have his theory of the ground at the back of your mind. Because, as I already said, to Kant there are innate rights, that which is mine by birth, my body, and there are acquired rights, that which at some point became mine, like my clothes. But the question to him is, of course, how can you acquire rights? How can you gain a right to something which previously was not yours? And here his answer that he gives is through the ground, because he says the ground is the only thing to which we have an innate right, and yet still it is not an inner but an outer right. It is a right to something that is not part of me, but rather that is an object outside of me, and yet still it is a right to something that I have by birth. Because by birth, I already have to inhabit a ground. As a human being, I need to stand or sit or lay somewhere. And for the time being, as I'm on that specific piece of land, no one else can inhabit the very same space as me without pushing me away. And this, to Kant, is the basis for acquiring all other outer rights, right? So if I have a piece of ground, then I also have a right to everything on that ground, the animals and the plants there, the resources, the minerals, the metals that might be in the ground, and so on and so forth. But it all comes from the ground. And so the point to Kant is that the ground, of course, is limited. Again, we inhabit a globe, and the Earth might be quite big, but it's not endless. And the more human beings there are, and of course, in our day, there are much, much more human beings than in Kant's day, the more limited the ground becomes. And this means to Kant that we cannot endlessly avoid each other, right? I mean, maybe in the Stone Age, when there were a few tens of thousands human beings on the whole Earth, two groups that met and that did not like each other could just go their separate ways and never see each other again. But the more human beings there are, the harder it gets to avoid each other. And since everyone has the right to some piece of ground, but the ground is limited, that means that eventually people also have a right to a piece of ground next to me, right? I cannot just tell them, go somewhere else where you are not in any sort of contact of neighborhood with me, if somewhere else is already taken. And if the ground was limitless, then this would be okay, Kant would say. Then we would not be obliged to necessarily enter stateswide or the right of nations with somebody else. Then we could also say, I don't want to have you as my neighbor, so you leave or I leave, but either way we never see each other again. We establish vast distance between each other, so that even without a common right binding us both, there is no way of us harming each other. But this is not possible on a limited globe. And for that very reason, we have to establish state right. We have to establish a right of nations to live peacefully as neighbors with each other. And for that reason, in turn, we need a cosmopolitan right, a right that demands hospitality and therefore makes it possible to establish these other sort of legal relations and contracts. Now, this general cosmopolitan right, with its principle of hospitality, you could say runs in two directions. It obliges both the visitor who visits others elsewhere as those being visited. Let's start with the latter. So, Kant says, according to the cosmopolitan right, every person must have a right of visitation everywhere else on Earth. Meaning, you must be able to go somewhere where you haven't been before, and maybe they don't even know of your existence or of the place you came from. And you must be able to visit there without being attacked on first sight to kill you or to rob you or to enslave you or whatever. And you must have the right to visit and to offer a peaceful, a just relationship with those that you visit. So here Kant thinks mainly of areas outside of Europe and outside the European framework of civilization and rights, and how they deal with foreigners and strangers. So he's talking about Arab desert nomads, and he says there are those tribes that consider some land theirs and that consider anyone who dares to pass through their land fair game, that they can attack caravans and that they can rob them and sell those people into slavery maybe. And this is not right according to the cosmopolitan principle of hospitality. Because how would they ever establish relations with anyone else if they, just attack anyone who enters their territory? Or also he is thinking of the pirates, the corsairs of the Barbary coasts of northern Africa, what is nowadays Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia and Libya, um, because the people there would attack European ships and once again would sell the people on those ships into slavery on the North African, on the Ottoman slave markets. This is something that famously happened to the Spanish poet Miguel de Cervantes, the author of the Don Quixote, who for a time was a captive, was a slave in North Africa until he was freed again, and who also included those experiences in his tale in Don Quixote. And also the first war that the rather newly established United States fought outside of America. The first war that they fought in the old world. Of course, by now they have fought many foreign wars from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan and now Iran. But the first such war was against these North African pirate states because they did not attack British ships because they did not want to mess with the British Empire and the British fleet. But of course, after the American War of Independence, their ships did no longer sail under British flags, so they were no longer protected, so they were attacked, and so they ended up fighting there to establish protection for their ships. So this is this was an important issue for the Europeans, but of course this is a much older issue. I mean, all the way back to antiquity, if you were maybe stranded in a foreign land, there was nothing to protect you. I mean, you were as free for the taking as the driftwood or whatever non-animate objects might have fallen into the sea from the ships. So you could easily end up a slave. I mean, you just have to read the Odyssey on that, right? After Odysseus loses his men, loses his ships, that is very much a danger he is in. That if he ends up on some foreign coast, they might just take him and enslave him. And so Kant says this mustn't be. This is not okay. People cannot just attack you and kill you and rob you and enslave you just because you pass through their territory or just because you travel with your ship off your coast. They must give you a chance to visit them. So a few years back there was this case in the media, right, about the Sentinel Island, which nominally belongs to India, but there's uncontacted native people living there. And someone went there and did not come back, was probably killed by those people. And we don't really know anything about those people as they are uncontacted. We don't know what was going on in their heads, what issue they took with him. But we can say that according to Kant, they do not follow the cosmopolitan right, and therefore make it impossible for anyone to contact them and to establish any sort of peaceful relation with them. And here we just have to apply the principle that Kant always uses to ask what is just. I already talked about it in my lecture, what is justice. That Kant has this experiment of reason, as he says, the maxim of publicity. He says you just have to ask yourself, is your maxim, so your principle of action, um, is it one that could stand being made public, or would making it public actually defeat its purpose? Would it actually destroy itself by becoming public? In the latter case, it is clearly unjust. And this works on all levels of justice. So, in stateswide, um, in how you deal with other individuals, you can ask yourself, if you want to poison someone's food, to murder him, what would happen if I made that public? If I let everyone know, including that person I want to murder, well, what would happen is he would not eat the food. So um, the whole action only works by being hidden, by you being sneaky. But what is right, what is just, does not have to fear the public. Likewise, in the right of nations, if you if one state plans to attack another state as soon as there's an opportune moment, um, it just has to ask itself, what if I made that public? Well, then the other state would probably prepare for that, right? Would probably fortify its borders, or even would attack us first. Not wait for a moment when they may be weakened and may be attacked, but rather use a moment when they are still strong to attack us and destroy us, right? Or if we were to try to trick others to say we want peace talks in a war, um, but use that just to lure out their leader, who comes under the white flag and thinks that he has protection, and then just trap him and kill him. We would have to ask ourselves what would happen if we made that public, and of course, what would happen is that they would not agree to these peace talks. And once again, we would have defeated our own purpose. So, this is the principle that Kant always uses, and it also works here in Cosmopolitan, right? I mean, imagine a people who were to put up a big sign on their coast saying, everyone who approaches, everyone who sets foot on our land, um, has no rights here. We are just gonna enslave them. Well, what would happen is, of course, people reading that sign from afar would probably turn and go away again. So you would defeat your own purpose. You would not end up getting any slaves. Um, so by that we can see that this is an unjust action, according to Kant's principle. And not just is it an unjust action, it is an action that runs against cosmopolitanism, against the values of universalism, against human progress. Because um, if you act like this, if you don't allow others to even visit you and to even offer to establish peaceful relations with you, um, then you are isolating yourself, right? And this would basically mean that all groups of human beings that are separate by oceans or by deserts or by mountains would forever remain separate and isolated and would never get in contact with one another. And there would never be a universal world society with universal rights and with universal progress. I mean, you would harm yourself by that as a people, because um, there would be no possibility of commerce with others, of getting any goods of from other parts of the world that you might not have. There would be no possibility of an exchange of knowledge, of science, right? I mean, maybe other people have made advancements in technology, in medicine, or whatever that you could profit from, but you choose to isolate yourself. Or maybe you have made some advancements that they haven't made, that they could profit from, but then maybe they would build up in your foundations. Maybe they would come up with a way to improve on what you have made, and the progress would come back to you. And again, you're isolating yourself from that. So this is why Kant is very much against such actions. What is important here to point out, however, is that Kant says within cosmopolitan right, there's only a right of visitation. There is not a right of becoming a guest, of staying. So all the cosmopolitan right demands is that if a foreigner comes to our lands, he is not attacked on sight, but rather he is given the chance to offer peaceful relations. It does not mean that we have to accept this. I mean, if he attacks without us attacking, then of course we can defend ourselves and drive him away anyways. But even if he does not attack, even if he stays peaceful, we don't have to accept his offer. I mean, maybe we don't trust him and don't want him here, or maybe we think that here it's already full and there's no place for him. Then we can always ask him to turn back and to leave us again. And if he refuses to do so, then we can take that as an attack. Even if he has not outright attacked us, if we ask him to leave and he doesn't, that already is a declaration of war, essentially. Because, I mean, he's on our land. He is only tolerated here, but he has no right to be here. It's our land. We have a right to be here. And so he is harming us. He is essentially taking parts of our property, of our land, if he stays on it without our permission. So now we have a right to drive him away, even with violence if need be. But only after we at least gave him the chance to offer peaceful relations. So this is important, I think, nowadays in regards to the issue of refugees. Kant would say, according to cosmopolitan right, we need to show them hospitality, which would not mean to him that we have to give asylum and refuge to everyone who comes here. We can turn people down, we can send people back again, but we have to give them a chance. So what is not okay is what the EU, which, like many others who are unworthy of it, got the Nobel Peace Prize. But I mean, of course, that thing is a joke anyways. I mean, at this point, it might as well be some meme. The EU tries to not even allow refugees to come here in the first place, right? It tries to turn itself into a fortress, the fortress Europe. So refugees on the Mediterranean that try to cross from Africa or from Turkey, they are regularly murdered. And it is murder. Any single refugee who drowns in the Mediterranean was murdered. I mean, we could easily save them all if we wanted to. We have the resources for that. I mean, the Mediterranean is already surveilled by drones that we buy from Israel or whatever. It would be easy to save those refugees, but we choose not to in many cases. and there are even so-called pushbacks, even though of course officially they are legal. But there are pushbacks where boats are driven off out of the waters of some country and back into international waters where we are not legally responsible for them. And of course, the EU also tries to not even let people get that far, not even let them get onto the Mediterranean. So we, and this is my tax money, right? We pay North African despots, like we pay regimes in Libya or in Algeria or whatever, to either take refugees and imprison them in concentration camps or to drive them back into the desert. I mean, of course, that's not what we do officially. Officially, we just pay them to deal with refugees. And then we basically close both our eyes and don't look too closely at how they deal with them. But I mean, everyone knows refugees are driven back into the desert to die. It's not a secret that the EU pays for that. And this, of course, goes totally against this principle of hospitality. Same in the US, right? When they are fencing themselves off against Mexico, trying to not let people cross, to kill people that even try to cross, and if they do manage to cross, also putting them into concentration camps, separating them from their kids, putting them into cages. This is against the principle of hospitality. You have to give people a chance to visit you and to at least offer to live with you peacefully. You don't have the obligation to accept it always. You can turn them back, but you have to at least give them the right to visit. And as for turning them away, here also I must make an important remark, and that is that Kant says, while you do have the right to turn somebody down who offers peaceful relations, and while you do have the right to send him away again, you only have this right in case sending him away is not a death sentence, right? So let's say a people lives on an island and somebody is being shipwrecked and is stranded on that island. Then, of course, what these people mustn't do, according to Cosmopolitan, right, is to immediately kill him or enslave him for daring to step on their island. I mean, especially since he didn't even choose it, he was just shipwrecked. What they can do in theory is say, we don't want you on our island, please leave again. But Kant says, if this is an island and not right, if it's not connected to other lands where he could go, if it's an island, they could not just drive him into the sea. Even if they use some sophistry and say, oh, but we are not killing him, we are allowing him to live, we are just not allowing him to live on our island. If he manages to swim to another shore, we are not stopping him. No, essentially this would mean killing him. So in this case, Kant would say, they would have to accept him amongst themselves until he could actually leave the island to somewhere where he could live, which is not the ocean, right? So let's say once a month a ship goes to that island to trade, then they would have to tolerate this person on their island for at least a month. And once the ship comes back next month, then they could put him on that ship and say, please go away on that ship, we don't want you here, go somewhere else. But until that ship comes, they would have to accept him there if there's no other way off the island. So this also, I think, is very relevant for today's refugee question, because while Kant would probably say, yes, we are not obliged to accept anyone who comes here for refuge. We are, in theory, allowed to send people away again. We can only do so if we can actually offer them a place to live safely and with dignity on this earth. So we cannot send them back if sending them back means sending them into a war zone or into some despotic regime that would immediately imprison them and torture them and kill them, or into a place where where there's hunger and people are starving. Because again, the public right in general is about the principle suum quique tribur, give to each his own. I can only claim rights for myself if I give rights to others, right? So in the state of nature, I can say, okay, this piece of land I want to be mine. So you mustn't step on it without my permission. You mustn't take anything from it, like the fruits from these trees growing on this land, without my permission, because I want this land for myself. I can say that maybe if I also say, and this other land next to it, this shall be yours. And just like I don't want you on my land, I will not step on your land without permission. Now I could rightfully demand others to respect my property because I have given them a property to live off that I respect. But I cannot demand them to respect what I claim for myself if I'm not willing to give them something for themselves that they can live off, right? So if I'm on a lone island and someone else is stranded there with me, then maybe I can say, okay, this half of the island shall be mine, so don't step on it. If you do, I will attack you and drive you off onto the other half, but then the other half shall be yours, and I will not step on it. So you mustn't take the coconuts from the trees on my half, they are for me to eat, but I will not eat those from your half. Okay, that I could do. But I cannot just say, okay, all this island is mine, you mustn't step on it, and all the coconuts of all the trees are mine, only I can eat it. Because then, even if I don't actively kill that other person, I'm essentially saying you have no right to live, right? There is no property through which you could live. There is no ground on which you are allowed to stand. There's no food which you are allowed to eat. So there's no place for you on this earth. You essentially have to jump into the ocean and die there. If I did that, then that other person would not be obliged to accept the property I claim, to respect that the island is mine, that the coconuts are mine. Why would he? Since I don't respect his property, I don't give him any property that I would be willing to respect. So likewise, if somebody comes here, for example, as a refugee, and we want him to respect that this land is ours, that there's already established property that he should respect, we can only do so if we can offer him some property of his own. So some piece of land where he can live, where he can dwell without being attacked, and where he can have food, where he can have a roof over his head. And if we cannot point him to some place outside of our land where he can have it, so if we cannot say, okay, we don't want you here, okay, maybe the country where you came from, you cannot live because there's a war or whatever. But look here, there's a third place that is empty that you can live on. As long as we cannot do that, then we don't have the right to send him away. So that's what the cosmopolitan right means for those being visited. First, give the visitor a chance to at least offer to establish some sort of peaceful relation. Don't attack him on sight. And second, you may decline his offer, you may send him away, but only under the condition that you can actually give him somewhere to live elsewhere. If sending him away is akin to sentencing him to die or to be enslaved or whatever, then you don't have that right to send him away. But let's now turn around. Because the cosmopolitan right is not just about how you behave towards the visitor, it's also about how you behave if you are the visitor in a foreign land. The principle of hospitality does not just say that you must show hospitality towards those that come to you. It also means that if you come to others, you must not abuse the hospitality that is shown to you. And while with the first part, Kant is mostly thinking of people outside of Europe and how they might treat Europeans that approach them. Here, he is very much thinking mostly of the Europeans and how they deal with people in other parts of the world. That is, here he is thinking of colonialism. You cannot just go somewhere, maybe at first establish peaceful relations, like first trading with people, establishing small trade outposts, coastal cities, or whatever. So first benefit from the fact that those people do act like they should according to the cosmopolitan right, that they did not attack you on first sight, but rather did let you visit them, but then abuse this trust they showed by eventually taking away their land, by eventually starting to enslave them. And here also, we can once again use the maxim of publicity to ask, is this just? So once again, we only have to ask, what if we made the principle according to which we act public, if we made it known? Well, just imagine the first pilgrims, the first settlers coming to North America. I mean, there's this whole story of Thanksgiving, right? How the Indians helped them out, how they gave them food. Imagine they would have told those Native Americans, yeah, well, there will come more and more of us, and our children, our grandchildren, our great grandchildren, they will take away your lands, and they will drive you off. There will be the Trail of Tears, and they will kill you, and they will get your people hooked on booze, and um, they will they will swindle you. They will trick you. They will buy land from you, and you may think that you are just selling, I don't know, the right to use the land to hunt there. But in their mind, they will actually buy the whole land and take every right from you, or they will um, create fake contracts, right? Like, for example, as they did in New Zealand, where the British made a contract with the native Maori, but the translation, the English version actually read a different text as the Maori version. So they thought they were signing one thing, but the British actually made them sign another thing. And if the settlers told them, well, and there will be genocide, and in the end we will have overtaken the whole land, and you will maybe be left with a few thousand people that are driven into reservoirs, and you will be very poor and suffer from alcoholism and depression, and there will be many crimes committed against you, right? Like there are many more murders there's a higher percentage of murders, and especially also murders of women disappearing, being abducted, amongst Native Americans nowadays than amongst white people. Like, if they had told all of that to the natives, then maybe those Indians would have just attacked them and driven them back into the sea. And likewise, consider the settler colonialism in Palestine, right? I mean, many of the Jews that came there at the end of the 19th century, at the start of the 20th century, um, the Palestinians first let them visit them, let them settle there. Um, they were in some cases first welcomed with open arms, but if they had told them what is gonna happen, if they had told them, well, we will take your land, and then we will make the colonial powers, which is essentially what the UN was for the most part after the Second World War, we will make them divide the land and give us more than half the land, when we will just be a third of the people on the land. And there will be the Nakba. You will be ethnically cleansed and driven away, and then you will live in refugee camps for decades, and you will live under an apartheid regime, and eventually there will be genocide. If they had said that at the start, then maybe the Palestinians would have driven away those first Jewish settlers that would not yet have had the power to prevent that, to protect themselves from being driven away. So again, according to this maxim of publicity, it's easy to see that this kind of behavior is not just. So what Kant is saying is that any sort of colonialism is against this principle, this cosmopolitan principle of hospitality. It is an abuse of others' hospitality. And this is also important for me to say, in light of the accusations that are made nowadays against Kant, because nowadays you often hear that Kant was a racist because of certain things that he said about human races. What he said exactly, and whether he was a racist or not, I will discuss in a separate lecture eventually. When I get to what Kant has to say about natural science, then I will also talk about what he had to say about race. But I want to point out that there's a difference between what you could call theoretical racism and practical racism. Because in theory, okay, Kant might have said there's different human races, and they might not just be different by their skin color. They might also be different in temperament and in their mental capabilities. So yes, there might be races that are superior to others. And of course, this ought to be criticized, and of course, this we would disagree with. But the point is that within Kant's philosophy, this does not matter one bit when it comes to morality, to how we should act ethically or legally. Because here, the only thing that matters is that a being has personhood, meaning it is a being with autonomy, a being that does not, like an animal, just follow its instincts, but rather that can set purposes for itself, so that has free will. It does not matter how smart that being is. It does not matter if the purposes it sets for itself are better or worse purposes. It just matters that this being has autonomy at all. This autonomy ought to be revered and not taken away. Period. That is what Kant says. So he disagrees with all sorts of pretenses for colonialism, like saying, "Oh, but we are bringing them civilization, right? We are lifting them up out of their poor primitive life, or we are bringing them the true religion, right? Um, we are they are just heathens that are going to hell, and we are saving their souls." um or saying, "Oh, those black and brown people, they are like immature children, and like children need their parents, they need to be guided by us, by the white man, it's the white man's burden to take care of them," or whatever. um Nowadays, um people against colonialism would meet such claims with counter arguments, with saying, maybe you did not bring them civilization, you just enslaved them, or saying maybe your civilization actually isn't superior to the culture they have, or whatever. um, but this, even though it may be well meaning, and even though it may be right, I find problematic, because whether you want it or not, what you are implying there is that if the argument of the colonizer was correct, uh, then he would have a right to colonize, right? If someone says, "Oh, I'm right to colonize these people because I bring them civilization," and your only answer is, "Well, you are actually not bringing them civilization, or your civilization that you're bringing is actually not superior," then what you're essentially saying is, you, in this particular instance, do not have the right to colonize them. But if someone really did have a superior civilization, um, they would have a right to colonize. Well, Kant is much more radical, because he is saying all these theoretical questions, who by nature is smarter or less smart, who has the superior civilization, who has the right religion, yada yada, all of that does not matter when it comes to the question of right, because freedom matters more. He would say, okay, maybe you do have a better civilization, then you can visit those primitive people and offer them the benefits of your civilization. Maybe you do have the true religion. No one is preventing you from sending missionaries that offer those people to convert to your faith. But what you cannot do is force it upon them, even if maybe it really would be better for them. You cannot force people to their benefit. I mean, here you just have to remember what the whole principle of Kant's philosophy of right is, as I already discussed in several previous lectures. Um, Kant says all our actions either follow morality, follow the moral law, or they follow the principle of happiness. I discussed this in the lecture on the imperatives. These are the only two principles of action to Kant. So either when these two conflict, of course, often they may not conflict. Often what is moral and what brings happiness might be the same. But if they do conflict, either I am willing to sacrifice happiness, to sacrifice subjective benefits, to not break the law, the moral law, to do what is right, or I am willing, in the name of the greater good, in the name of happiness, to do an injustice, to break the moral law. The latter would be the principle of eudaimonism, from eudaimonia, the Greek word for happiness. And Kant's whole practical philosophy is in large parts about him rejecting eudaimonism. And if you were to colonize people in the name of what is good for them, in the name of bringing them happiness, you would just be following the principle of eudaimonism. And you would also be a consequentialist, which always goes hand in hand. So consequentialist is someone who is saying what matters is the consequences of our actions, and any means necessary to achieve good consequences is okay to use. Well, about this I also already talked in a lecture on why morality is not about the consequences of our actions. Kant very much rejects this consequentialism that says you are allowed to do evil in the name of greater good. No, you are never allowed to do evil. And this goes for, once again, for all three levels of the public rights. So Kant says you cannot do an injustice, even if you claim it's one final injustice, in order to establish a better future. So within stateswide, he is saying you cannot do a revolution, which by definition is an injustice. It breaks the law of that state. Even if you claim that it is just this one time in order to then establish a more just system. Maybe you are right, and the system right now really is despotic. And maybe you are right, what you would establish, the new government, really would be better and bring more happiness to the people. But you cannot just, in the name of future happiness, engage in this breaking of the law and in this bloodshed right now that the revolution would be. I discussed that in its own lecture on what Kant has to say about revolutions. And likewise, within the right of nations, you cannot say, oh, I'm starting a big war, even if it is to end all wars. I'm trying to conquer the whole earth and to create a universal state, a universal monarchy, where then there would be happiness for everyone because there would no longer be wars. Maybe you even would succeed. Maybe you could conquer the whole earth and thereby establish peace and make everyone happy. But you have no right to commit an injustice, that is to attack others that have not attacked you, to start wars, and again to engage in all this bloodshed in the name of some future happiness. And so this same principle applies here within the cosmopolitan right. Maybe it would be best for the people you are colonizing to be colonized. Maybe you would be like a benevolent father to immature children. Maybe you would bring them civilization and happiness and whatever. But to Kant, the whole point is that none of this matters, because you have no right to break the right, to violate people's rights, to commit an injustice, even just once, in the name of future eternal happiness. Because to Kant, he simply isn't a eudaimonist. So happiness simply isn't what matters most. What matters most is the right, is human dignity, which means human freedom. I already said it in earlier lectures, in the lecture on what is the republic, what is despotism. Within stateswide, Kant says despotism is if you have laws that restrict freedom more than necessary. Despotism is if you have laws that you could not have given to yourself, if there's no freedom in the state. Even if the despot is paternalistic, that is, he is benevolent, he acts like a father trying to make people within the state happy, it's still despotic. And if you don't live like an animal yourself, if you have any sense for your true worth as a human being, which comes from your reason that gives you autonomy, then you cannot be happy under such conditions. Because being forced to be happy according to someone else's concept of happiness being treated like an immature child instead of having the freedom to pursue your own happiness, that is so much against human dignity that you cannot really find happiness in such a state. Well, this Kant says when it comes to how the state is governed. This, therefore, he would also say about colonialism. Even if the enlightened Europeans could make other people happy, it would be so against the human dignity of those other people in other parts of the world uh, that they could not find true happiness in that anyways. So therefore, the cosmopolitan right demands not just that we give others a right to visit us and to offer the establishment of peaceful relationships. It also means that if we visit other parts of the earth, if we visit other continents, um, we don't abuse others' hospitality and we don't try to take over. We don't try to rob them. We don't try to trick them, to drive them off their land. We don't colonize. We don't enslave them. And this has nothing to do whether we are or aren't superior. Because even if we are superior, someone who is superior still has no right to mistreat those who are inferior and to violate their rights. That's the important point in Kant's whole philosophy. It does not matter whether you are superior or inferior or the same. You still have the same universal rights. And now I'm at the end of what Kant has to say. But I want to close this off by pointing out that this cosmopolitan right is incredibly important and incredibly visionary. And it's easy to overlook this. Kant only writes a few pages about it, there's no text that is only about the cosmopolitan right. It's texts about other topics, like the states' right, like the right between nations, where then in the last few pages he will say some words about cosmopolitan right. So it's easy to overlook it, to not pay it so much mind. Also, as a modern reader, it's easy to think that this is very much relevant for Kant's own time, but not so much for our time. To think, oh, okay, he is talking about desert nomads and Barbary pirates that might attack traders, or he is talking about European colonialists and imperialists. That was the 18th century. That is not our world anymore. So this part is not so relevant for us. I think you would be very mistaken to do so. I think what Kant has to say here is very important and relevant. It even became more important in the 20th century than probably Kant himself ever anticipated. I think he himself maybe could not have truly seen how important this part of his philosophy was and how visionary he was. But here you should turn to Hannah Arendt and what she had to say about the imperialism at the end of the 19th century, what she had to say about the breakdown of the European nation state system in the world wars, and what she had to say about totalitarianism. And if you want this in more detail, while I have not yet started a big lecture series about Arendt, like I'm giving about Kant here, I have given a lecture on Arendt's concept of totalitarianism and how it helps us understanding, especially Israel nowadays, but also the US under Trump, or also Putin. So you might turn to that lecture for more details. But basically, what Arendt is saying is that the most important human right, even the only human right in a sense, is the right to citizenship, because this is the right to have rights at all. Arendt pointed out that traditionally we had rights towards our fellow citizens, and the state was there to protect our rights, right? To protect my life or my property from my neighbor. It was the Americans and the French after their revolutions that established or declared human rights. And that was because the question had arisen, okay, the state protects me from my fellow citizen, from my neighbor, but who protects me from the state, right? What if the monarch of the state is a despot? And well, the revolutionaries claimed we as human beings have certain inalienable rights that the state has to respect. And if it doesn't, then that gives us the right to revolt against the state. So the human rights, while they were called human rights, were essentially, Arendt says, for humans within the state to be protected from the state. But she says the 20th century had shown that in the moment a human being really becomes nothing but a human being. So when someone stops to be a German or a Frenchman or a Pole and is just reduced to his humanity, then he also loses his human rights. Great crimes against humanity, like genocide, are especially possible if people have no citizenship. You can see it statistically that in Western Europe, even in Germany itself, about 1 in 2 Jews survived the Nazi Holocaust. But in Eastern Europe, about 1 in 20 Jews survived. What's the difference? The difference is, of course, that in Western Europe, the states stayed intact. They might have been taken over by the Nazis, they might have been occupied by the Nazis, but they still were states. While in Poland, Ukraine, the Baltics, Belarus, states completely broke down, and you essentially had a wild no man's land with no laws where anything was possible. And it was mainly the stateless people that were most threatened. Like in France, for example, those Jews that had French citizenship, they were more or less protected somewhat. The Nazis could not just deport them without first stripping them of their citizenship. But Jewish refugees from Poland that had no French citizenship, the French did not feel responsible for them. They were in many cases happy to be rid of them. And this, of course, you can see nowadays with the Palestinians, who are a stateless people. I mean, those that have Israeli citizenship, they are not so easy to get rid of, even though, of course, a majority of Israelis would like to get rid of them. But those in the West Bank, those in Gaza, they have no rights at all. And likewise, of course, all those refugees around the world who are essentially stateless, who have left their states behind, their states don't feel responsible for them, or also their states have broken down in civil wars or whatever, failed states. They also essentially have no human rights at all, right? Those very same states, like in Europe, that claim to stand for human rights, that claim to have the rule of law, yeah, well, that might be true somewhat if you are part of that system, but if you are not part of any sort of legal framework, you have no more rights than a wild animal that can also just be shot on sight. So Arendt would say, even if you are a second class citizen, even if you lack certain rights, even very basic rights, like equality or whatever, or basic freedoms, um, this can change. You are still somewhat protected and you can maybe fight for your rights. But if you are not part of a legal community at all, if you are not protected by any sort of legal framework, if no legal institution, no government, whatever feels responsible for you, you're just superfluous and anything can happen to you. That is why she says citizenship is the most basic, is the only human right. And that is, I think, why Kant's cosmopolitan right is so important and visionary. Arendt showed that when statehood breaks down, when people stop being citizens, when they are essentially thrown back into the state of nature, anything, even genocide, is possible. She showed that totalitarianism, that what Hitler and Stalin did, is actually not, as many people might think, an especially authoritarian, especially strict state, but quite the opposite. It is the destruction of the state. The totalitarians want to throw everyone back into the state of nature, where you have the rule of the strong, which of course they will be, because they have a whole movement, right? The National Socialist movement, the Bolshevik movement, behind themselves. That's why we should be so weary and so suspicious of those right wingers and libertarians like Trump or Musk in the US, or like Milei in Argentina, that want to destroy the state. Essentially, they want to destroy our rights. They want to destroy our protections. They want to throw us back into the state of nature. And here is exactly the place where the cosmopolitan right is needed. We need universal global hospitality. We need to not treat people that are not part of the same legal framework as us, that do not have any established rights, any citizenship or whatever. We must not treat them as wild animals that we can just attack, but rather we must treat them with basic hospitality. We must at least give an opportunity for us and them to establish legal relations. We must give them an opportunity to enter our legal framework, to gain rights. And so this cosmopolitan right is basically what would prevent totalitarianism. And with that, I'm now ending my lectures on Kant's philosophy of right. I've talked about the public right since the beginning of this year. I've talked about the private right even before that. I am now closing this off. And after having discussed the philosophy of right and before that the ethics, there's one more additional lecture I want to give about that, where I want to talk about what Kant has to say about animals and how we should treat animals. Because, of course, now the whole time, both in ethics and in right, I mostly focused on how we should treat other human beings or ourselves. But of course, nowadays there's also many people that will care about animals, and so I want to discuss what Kant has to say here. But then I want to close off this topic for good and want for the next few lectures to turn to the question of happiness. So, while Kant does say, while he is against the principle of eudaimonism, while he does say we mustn't do an injustice in the name of happiness, he of course does not say that we mustn't be happy. We are allowed to pursue happiness within the bounds of what is moral, what is just, and he does have some things to say about how that works, about how we can become happy. So that shall be my next topic after briefly discussing animal rights or animal ethics. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenk Kubilay Altu, Thomas Deuringer, Kim Giamatti, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.